An elderly mechanic repairs John Kennedy's car, and a week later, Kennedy stops by and is shocked when the sun dipped low over the Louisiana horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson, casting long shadows across the quiet outskirts of Baton Rouge. In a small weathered auto repair shop tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered diner, Henry Carter hunched over a workbench, the dim glow of a flickering fluorescent light illuminating his workspace. At 72, Henry was a man carved from time and toil, his hands rough as sandpaper, etched with decades of grease and grit. His gray hair, thinning but neatly combed, framed a face lined with stories he rarely told. The shop, Carter's Auto Repair, was a relic of a bygone era, its faded sign barely legible, the concrete floor stained with years of oil spills. Yet it stood defiant, a testament to Henry's stubborn refusal to let the world move on without him. Tools hung meticulously on pegboards, each in its place, and the air carried the sharp tang of metal and motor oil. Henry wiped his brow with a rag, his fingers trembling slightly, not from age, but from a dull ache in his chest that had been nagging him for weeks. He ignored it, as he always did. There was work to be done, and Henry Carter didn't have time for weakness. The shop was quiet tonight, the kind of quiet that settled over small towns when the day wound down. Most folks were home eating supper or watching the evening news. Henry preferred it this way, no distractions, just him and the machines. He was tinkering with a carburetor. His eyes narrowed in focus when the low rumble of an engine broke the silence. It wasn't the smooth purr of a well-tuned car, but a sputtering, choking sound, like a beast struggling to breathe. Henry set down his wrench and squinted toward the open garage door. Headlights cut through the dusk, and a sleek black sedan rolled to a stop just outside. The engine coughed one last time before falling silent. Henry grunted, already diagnosing the problem in his mind. Probably a clogged fuel line or a bad alternator. He'd seen it 1,000 times. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out, his silhouette tall and lean against the fading light. He wore a tailored navy suit, the kind that looked expensive but not flashy, and his dark hair was neatly trimmed. As he approached, Henry caught a glimpse of his face, sharp features, a calm demeanor, and eyes that carried a quiet intensity. There was something familiar about him, but Henry couldn't place it. Probably just another city type passing through, he thought, someone who didn't know a spark plug from a socket wrench. The man stopped at the edge of the garage, his polished shoes a stark contrast to the gritty floor. "Evening," he said, his voice steady with a faint southern drawl that marked him as a local, or at least someone who'd spent enough time in Louisiana to blend in. "Think you could take a look at my car? She's giving me trouble." Henry eyed the vehicle, a late-model Cadillac, sleek, but not ostentatious. It was the kind of car a lawyer or a politician might drive, not the usual beat-up pickup or rusty hatchback that rolled into his shop. He gave the man a once-over, then nodded. "A motor's a motor," he said gruffly, grabbing his toolbox from the bench. "Let's see what's wrong with her." The man smiled faintly, as if amused by Henry's bluntness, and stepped aside to let him work. Henry popped the hood, the hinges creaking, and leaned in his hands, moving with the precision of a surgeon. He didn't need a diagnostic computer or a fancy scanner. His fingers could feel the problem, his ears could hear it. The man stood nearby, watching with a quiet curiosity that surprised Henry. Most customers wandered off or scrolled on their phones, but this one seemed genuinely interested. "You work alone?" the man asked, breaking the silence. Henry didn't look up, his hands deep in the engine bay, twisting a wrench. "Always have," he replied, his voice rough but not unkind. "These days nobody wants to fix things right. They just slap on new parts, charge you a fortune, and call it a day." The man nodded, folding his arms casually. I respect that. A real mechanic. Henry snorted a flicker of pride in his chest. Damn right. He tightened a bolt, then paused, a sharp pang shooting through his ribs. His breath hitched, and for a split second his vision blurred. He gripped the edge of the hood, steadying himself, and forced the pain down. Not now, he thought. He had a job to finish. The man didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't say anything. Henry shook it off and kept working his hands steady, despite the tremor in his chest. As he probed the engine, Henry muttered to himself, half to the car, half to the stranger. Too many computers in these things. Wires everywhere. Cars used to have soul, you could feel the machine. Now it's all circuits and sensors. The man chuckled softly. You sound like you've been doing this a while. Henry glanced at him, wiping grease from his fingers. Since '74. Opened this shop and never left. Kept it running when the big chains tried to push me out. The man's eyebrows lifted, slightly impressed. That's rare. Most places like this are gone now. Henry shrugged, turning back to the engine. Folks still need someone they can trust. Not many of us left, though. The man leaned in slightly, watching Henry's hands move with a rhythm born of decades. What got you into this line of work? He asked. Henry paused the question, catching him off guard. He wasn't one for small talk, but there was something about the man's tone genuine, not just polite chatter. My old man Henry said after a moment. He was a mechanic in the war. Taught me everything. Said a man who can fix things is never out of work. He snorted, a wry smile tugging at his lips. Guess he was right. The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. Sounds like a wise man. Henry didn't respond, but the memory of his father's stern, calloused hands guiding his own over an engine warmed him for a moment. He pushed it aside and focused on the task at hand. The Cadillac's problem was simple, a loose fuel line and a clogged filter. Henry worked methodically, his tools an extension of himself. The man stayed close, asking occasional questions, not the annoying kind, but ones that showed he was paying attention. You always this thorough, he asked at one point, watching Henry double-check a connection. Henry grunted. If you're gonna do it right. Half-assed odd work just means they're back in a week. The man smiled again, a real smile this time, not just polite. I like that. Not enough people think that way anymore. Henry didn't reply, but he felt a grudging respect for the stranger. Most people didn't care how the job got done as long as it was done. This guy, whoever he was, seemed to get it. The pain in Henry's chest flared again, sharper this time, like a knife twisting between his ribs. He froze, his hand tightening around a wrench, and for a moment he thought he might collapse. He leaned against the car, his breath shallow, waiting for it to pass. The man's eyes flickered with concern. You okay? He asked, his voice low. Henry waved him off, forcing a gruff laugh. Just old bones. Nothing to worry about. He straightened, ignoring the sweat beading on his forehead, and went back to work. The man didn't push, but Henry could feel his gaze watchful, like he'd seen more than Henry wanted him to. Minutes ticked by, the only sounds the clink of tools and the occasional creak of the shop's old beams. Henry finished the repair, tightening the last bolt and wiping his hands on his rag. All right, he said, stepping back. Try her now. The man slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and the engine roared to life, smooth and strong. Henry crossed his arms, a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. There she is, he said, almost to himself. The man grinned, running his hands over the steering wheel. Sounds perfect. You're a magician. Henry snorted. Just a mechanic. The man climbed out, reaching for his wallet. How much do I owe you? Henry shook his head, a stubborn glint in his eye. Nothing. Seeing a car run right is enough for me. The man paused, clearly surprised. "You sure that was no small fix?" Henry waved him off again. "I don't charge for easy jobs. Just don't go breaking her again." The man studied him for a long moment, then nodded a quiet respect in his expression. "Fair enough. I'll bring you a coffee next time I'm around." Henry chuckled a rare sound. "Just don't bring that overpriced chain stuff. Real coffee, black, no sugar." The man laughed a warm, easy sound. "Deal." As the man climbed back into the Cadillac, he leaned out the window. "See you around, Mr. Carter." Henry just grunted, watching as the car pulled onto the road, its taillights fading into the dusk. He didn't know who the man was, didn't care to ask. To Henry, he was just another customer, another job done right. But as he turned to lock up the shop, the ache in his chest returned heavier this time. He gripped the doorframe, his breath ragged, waiting for it to pass. It always passed. He flicked off the lights, the shop falling into darkness, and shuffled to his truck. Another day, another car. He had no idea that the man he'd just helped was John Neely Kennedy, a United States Senator, nor did he know that their brief encounter would spark something far bigger than a fixed fuel line. John Kennedy drove through the quiet Louisiana night, the Cadillac humming beneath him. His hands rested lightly on the wheel, but his mind was elsewhere. There was something about Henry Carter, gruff, stubborn, but honest to the core. In a world of polished speeches and calculated moves, Henry was real, a man who worked with his hands and took pride in it. John had met countless people in his career, but few left an impression like Henry. As he navigated the empty roads, he made a mental note to stop by the shop again, maybe bring that coffee Henry had mentioned. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn to the old mechanic, like their meeting wasn't just chance. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that their paths would cross again soon, and when they did, everything would change. Back at the shop, Henry climbed into his truck, the engine sputtering to life. The pain in his chest lingered, a quiet warning he refused to heed. He'd been through worse, he told himself. He'd keep going, just like always. The shop was his life, his legacy, and he wasn't about to let a little discomfort stop him. As he drove home, the stars brightening above, he thought of the stranger in the suit, the way he'd watched him work, the respect in his eyes. Henry didn't know who he was, but for the first time in a long time, he felt seen. And that, more than anything, stayed with him as he disappeared into the night. The Louisiana sun hung low, casting a golden haze over the sleepy outskirts of Baton Rouge, where the air smelled of damp earth and faint traces of motor oil. A week had passed since John Neely Kennedy's Cadillac sputtered into Henry Carter's auto shop, and the memory of the gruff mechanic with grease-stained hands lingered in John's mind. He couldn't shake the image of Henry's quiet pride, the way his fingers danced over the engine with a precision that felt like art. John had seen plenty in his years as a senator, people chasing power, fame, or fleeting moments of glory. But Henry was different. He was a man who built something real, something lasting, and asked for nothing in return. That kind of integrity was rare, and John found himself wanting to know more. Today he'd made time in his schedule to swing by Carter's auto repair, a black coffee in hand, no sugar, just as Henry had demanded. The gesture felt small, but it was a start, a way to say thank you to a man who'd refused payment for his work. John's Cadillac glided down the familiar stretch of road, the shop's faded sign coming into view. But as he pulled closer, his brow furrowed. The garage door was shut, the lights off, and the lot empty. No clatter of tools, no hum of an engine being tested, just silence. A single sheet of paper taped crookedly to the door fluttered in the breeze. John parked and stepped out, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. The note was handwritten, The ink smudged closed indefinitely. His stomach tightened. Something was wrong. Henry wasn't the type to shut down without a fight. John scanned the shop's exterior, half expecting the old mechanic to emerge from the shadows, wrench in hand, barking about lazy customers. But the place was still almost ghostly, the kind of quiet that carried weight. Across the street, the laundromat's neon sign buzzed faintly. A man in his 60s, wearing a faded flannel shirt and a worn baseball cap, leaned against the doorway, watching John with a knowing look. John crossed the road, the coffee still warm in his hand. "You know what happened here?" he asked, nodding toward the shop. The man straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You're the fella from last week, aren't you? The one with the Cadillac?" John nodded, surprised. "I'm Bill." The man continued, his voice rough but warm. "Own this place. Saw you talking to Henry that night." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Henry's in the hospital. Had a bad spell a few days ago. Real bad." John's grip on the coffee cup tightened, the heat burning his palm. "What kind of spell?" Bill's eyes softened, heavy with worry. "Heart trouble. One of his regulars found him in the garage, hunched over a toolbox, trying to push through like it was nothing. Stubborn old fool, wouldn't call for help. They rushed him to County General." John's mind flashed back to that night in the shop. Henry pausing, clutching his chest, brushing it off as old bones. He should have pressed, should have seen the signs. "How's he doing?" John asked, his voice low. Bill shrugged, the gesture heavy. "Stable last I heard, but he's not out of the woods. Henry's been running on fumes for years. Never took a day off, never saw a doctor." Now, he trailed off, glancing at the darkened shop. "Now, I don't know if he's coming back." The words hit John like a punch. Henry wasn't just a mechanic. He was a fixture, a man who'd held this corner of the world together with his hands and his heart. The thought of him fading away in a hospital bed, his shop left to rot, felt wrong, like a betrayal of everything Henry stood for. John thanked Bill and turned back to his car, the coffee forgotten on a nearby bench. County General wasn't far, a 20-minute drive. He needed to see Henry to understand what was happening. As he slid into the driver's seat, his phone buzzed, a reminder of a meeting with aides to discuss upcoming legislation. He silenced it. This was more important. The hospital's sterile halls smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, a stark contrast to the gritty warmth of Henry's garage. John moved with purpose, his suit drawing curious glances from nurses and visitors. At the front desk, a young woman typed Henry's name into her computer. "Room 3117, third floor," she said, her voice clipped. "He's stable, but don't expect him to talk much. He's been through a lot." John nodded, thanking her, and headed for the elevator. Stable was good, but the nurse's tone told him there was more to the story. The third floor was quiet, the beeping of monitors and muffled voices the only sounds. Room 317's door was ajar, and John paused before entering, steeling himself. Henry lay in the bed, his face pale and IV dripping into his arm. The heart monitor beside him beeped steadily, a lifeline in the dim room. He looked smaller than John remembered, his broad shoulders sunken. His hands still but restless, as if itching for a wrench. John stepped inside, pulling a chair close to the bed. Henry's eyes cracked open, and for a moment, a spark of recognition flickered. "Well, damn!" He rasped, his voice weak but sharp. "Don't tell me that Cadillac's acting up already." John chuckled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. Even now, Henry was still Henry. "Nope," John said, leaning forward. "She's running like a dream, thanks to you." Henry snorted, then winced, a hand drifting to his chest. John's smile faded. "How bad is it, Henry?" The old man's gaze drifted to the ceiling, his jaw tight. Doctors say my heart's got a mind of its own. Too many years ignoring it, I guess. Can't just swap it out like a bad alternator. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough. John's hands clenched in his lap. This wasn't just a bad week. This was serious, maybe final. He leaned closer, his voice firm but gentle. I want to help Henry. Whatever you need, bills, doctors, anything. Henry's eyes hardened, and he shook his head slow but resolute. I don't take handouts, kid. Never have, never will. John exhaled frustration mingling with respect. He'd expected this, but it didn't make it easier. It's not a handout, he said. It's what you're owed for a lifetime of doing things right. Henry's gaze softened, but he didn't budge. Appreciate it, but no. I've got enough to cover this. Barely. His voice cracked on the last word, betraying the weight he carried. John sat back, his mind racing. Money wouldn't work not with Henry. He needed another way, something that honored the man's pride, his legacy. The room fell silent, save for the heart monitor's steady rhythm. John's eyes wandered to a small stack of get-well cards on the bedside table, some handwritten, others store-bought. You've got a lot of folks pulling for you, he said, nodding toward the cards. Henry glanced at them, his expression unreadable. Yeah, customers mostly, good people. John picked up a card, its front adorned with a cartoon dog holding a wrench. Inside, a scrawled note read, Get better, Henry. You fixed my old Ford when no one else could. Maggie. Another said, You're the only one I trust with my truck. Come back soon. Ray. John's throat tightened. These weren't just customers. They were a community people whose lives Henry had touched one repair at a time. An idea began to form, faint but growing. John set the card down. Henry, you ever think about what happens to your shop if you're not there? Henry's brow furrowed, his voice gruff. It closes. That's how it works. John tilted his head, pressing gently. And that sits right with you. All those years, all those cars, all those people who count on you just gone. Henry's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. John could see it, the weight of the question sinking in. The shop wasn't just a business. It was Henry's life, his proof that he'd mattered. Letting it die would be like letting a part of himself fade away. John leaned forward, his voice steady. You've built something special, Henry. Not just a shop, but a way of doing things honest, thorough, real. That's worth saving. Henry's eyes met his, searching, skeptical. What are you getting at? John smiled faintly, the idea taking shape. I'm saying maybe your work doesn't have to end. Maybe it's time to pass it on. Henry snorted, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. Pass it on? To who? Kids these days don't care about turning a wrench. They're all on their phones chasing quick money. John didn't argue. He knew Henry was half right, times had changed and skilled trades were fading. But he'd seen enough of the world to know that hunger for meaning never went away. There were kids out there, young people looking for purpose, for something tangible to hold on to. Henry's shop could be that for them, a place to learn to build, to carry forward what he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. John didn't say it out loud, not yet. He needed time to think, to plan. But the seed was planted, and he could feel it taking root. A nurse entered, checking Henry's chart, breaking the moment. John stood glancing at the old man in the bed. I'll be back, Henry. You rest up. Henry grunted, his eyes already half closed. Don't need you hovering, kid. Go do whatever it is you do. John chuckled, but as he stepped into the hallway, his smile faded. Henry was fighting, but he was tired, worn down by years of carrying the shop alone. John couldn't let that be the end of his story. Outside, the evening air was cool, the sky streaked with purple. John climbed into his Cadillac, his mind buzzing. He thought of the cards, the notes, the people who'd written them. Henry's shop wasn't just a business. It was a cornerstone, a place where trust was forged over decades. John pulled out his phone and dialed his aide, Sarah, a sharp young woman who'd been with him for years. "Sarah, I need you to look into something for me," he said when she answered. "Find out everything you can about Carter's auto repair in Baton Rouge. History, customers, anything in the community tied to it. And check on local programs for vocational training, especially for young people." Sarah paused, clearly surprised. Okay, Senator. Mind if I ask what this is about?" John smiled, staring at the hospital's glowing windows. "Just a hunch." As he drove back to the city, John's thoughts turned to the shop, its darkened windows, its locked door. He pictured Henry's tools, still hanging on their pegboard, waiting for hands to pick them up. He thought of the kids Henry had dismissed, the ones who might never know the satisfaction of fixing something with their own hands. And he thought of Henry lying in that hospital bed, his legacy hanging by a thread. John wasn't a mechanic, but he knew how to build things, coalitions, policies, movements. Maybe, just maybe, he could build something for Henry, something that would outlast them both. The road stretched ahead, and for the first time in a long time, John felt a spark of purpose that had nothing to do with politics. This wasn't about votes or headlines. This was about a man who'd given everything to his craft and a chance to make sure that craft lived on. The Louisiana air hung heavy with the scent of summer rain, a faint drizzle misting the outskirts of Baton Rouge as the newly reborn Henry Carter Technical Garage stood proud under a sky of slate-gray clouds. The old auto shop, once a fading monument to a bygone era, had been transformed into something vibrant, its weathered facade now adorned with fresh paint and a bold sign that declared Henry Carter Technical Garage. Since 1974. Because some things deserve to be done right. Inside, the concrete floor, etched with decades of oil stains, gleamed under bright overhead lights, and the walls were lined with pristine tool racks, each wrench and socket a silent promise of work to be done. John Neely Kennedy stood near a workbench, his suit jacket slung over a stool, his eyes tracing the scene before him. The shop buzzed with life, young voices mingling with the clank of metal, the hum of an engine being tested, the sharp bark of Henry Carter's instructions, cutting through it all. At 72, Henry was frailer than he'd been that night with John's Cadillac, his steps slower, his hands trembling faintly from the strain of his recovering heart. But here, surrounded by tools and eager students, he was a force, his gruff voice carrying the weight of a lifetime spent mastering his craft. "You're twisting that bolt like it owes you money," he snapped at a lanky teenager named Jamal, who fumbled with a ratchet. "Ease up, son. Feel the thread or you'll strip it." Jamal nodded, sweat beading on his forehead, and adjusted his grip, his focus intense. John smiled quietly. This was what he'd fought for, not just a shop, but a living legacy, a place where Henry's way of doing things could inspire a new generation. It had been 6 weeks since John stood in the sterile glow of County General, watching Henry fight for breath, his pride as unyielding as ever. The old mechanic's refusal of financial help had sparked something in John, a determination to honor Henry's life in a way that went beyond money. In that hospital room, surrounded by get-well cards from a community that revered him, John had seen the truth. Henry wasn't just a mechanic. He was a cornerstone, a man who'd built trust one repair at a time. The idea of turning the shop into a training center, a place where young people could learn the art of fixing cars with the same care and precision Henry embodied, had taken root and grown into a mission. John had thrown himself into the project, leveraging his connections as a senator to secure funding, partnering with a local community college to design a vocational program, and rallying volunteers to renovate the shop. It wasn't about charity. It was about preserving something rare, something the world needed more of. Henry had grumbled about the fuss, especially the new sign bearing his name. "Don't need my name on a damn building," he'd muttered, his arms crossed. John had just grinned. "It's not a building, Henry. It's a story, one worth telling." That had quieted him, though the spark in Henry's eyes betrayed his pride. Today was the grand reopening, and the shop was alive with a crowd that spilled out into the lot. Cars lined the street, rusted pickups, polished sedans, even a vintage Mustang that drew admiring glances. Former customers, some who'd known Henry since the shop opened in '74, swapped stories near a restored Chevy, their voices thick with nostalgia. "Fixed my old Pontiac when I was flat broke," one man said, his gray beard twitching with a smile. "Told me to pay him when I could. Never forgot that." A woman nodded, clutching a coffee cup. "Henry stayed late to get my van running so I could make it to my daughter's graduation. Wouldn't take a dime extra." John listened from a distance, his chest tightening. These weren't just stories. They were the threads of a life woven into the fabric of this community, proof that Henry's work had mattered in ways that went beyond engines and oil changes. Inside the shop was a hive of activity. A dozen teenagers, the first students of the new program, worked under Henry's watchful eye. Some were locals, others from tougher parts of town, kids who had been written off by schools or caught in the churn of hard circumstances. The community college had handpicked them, seeing potential where others saw problems. Lena, a quiet girl with a quick mind, knelt beside a carburetor, her fingers probing carefully as Henry loomed over her. "See that jet?" he said, pointing. "If it's clogged, your engine's gonna choke. Clean it right, or you're wasting everyone's time." Lena nodded, her focus unbroken, and used a small brush with the care of a jeweler. Nearby, Marcus, a wiry kid with a nervous energy, was under a hood, tightening a fuel line. "Don't overdo it," Henry warned, his voice sharp but not cruel. "You're not arm wrestling the damn thing." Marcus grinned, easing off, and when the line held, his shoulders straightened with a flicker of pride. John watched it all, seeing not just kids learning a trade, but young people finding purpose, a reason to show up a skill that could carry them forward. The shop's transformation was striking. New workbenches lined the walls, stocked with tools donated by a local hardware chain. A corner had been set up as a classroom, with a whiteboard and a stack of manuals where students would learn theory alongside practice. A small office, once Henry's cluttered hideout, now housed a computer for tracking student progress, a concession to the modern world that Henry had grudgingly accepted. Volunteers retired, mechanics, community college instructors, even a few of Henry's old customers moved through the space offering tips and encouragement. The air was thick with the sounds of progress. The clink of wrenches, the hiss of an air compressor, the laughter of kids teasing each other over a misstep. It was chaotic, messy, alive. And it was exactly what John had envisioned when he'd stood in that hospital room, promising himself that Henry's work wouldn't end. Henry moved through the crowd, his steps deliberate, his breathing careful. The doctors had been clear his heart was still fragile, and overexertion could land him back in the hospital. But here, surrounded by the clatter of tools and the hum of engines, Henry seemed to draw strength from the work itself. He paused to correct a boy named Carlos, who was struggling with a lug nut. "You're fighting it," Henry said, his hand hovering but not touching. "Let the tool do the work. Feel the resistance, then push through." Carlos nodded, his jaw tight, and when the nut loosened, his face lit up with a grin. Henry grunted, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Not bad. Keep at it." John saw it. The teacher Henry had never known he could be the mentor these kids needed. It wasn't just about fixing cars. It was about showing them they could master something, that their hands could build a future. A local news crew wove through the crowd, their camera panning across the shop. A young reporter, her ponytail bouncing, approached Henry with a microphone. "Mr. Carter, what does it mean to see your shop become a training center for the next generation?" Henry scratched his jaw, his eyes narrowing as if the question was a trick. "Means I'm not done yet," he said, his voice gruff but steady. The reporter smiled, pressing for more. "And how does it feel to know your legacy will live on?" Henry's gaze drifted to the kids working nearby, to the tools gleaming on the walls. "Feels like I did something right," he said simply, then turned back to Carlos, who was now wrestling with another nut. The reporter laughed undeterred and moved on to interview a volunteer. John chuckled under his breath. Henry would never be one for grand speeches, but his words carried weight, each one earned through a lifetime of grit. As the afternoon stretched on, John found himself talking to Sarah, his aide, who had been instrumental in pulling the project together. She stood near the classroom corner, her clipboard tucked under her arm, her eyes bright with excitement. "This is bigger than I expected," she said, gesturing to the crowd. "The college says they've got 30 kids on a wait list already. Some of them are from neighborhoods where opportunities like this don't come around." John nodded his gaze on Lena, who was now explaining the carburetor to a younger student. "That's the point," he said. "Give them a skill, a purpose, and they'll build their own way." Sarah glanced at Henry, who was showing Jamal how to check an oil filter. "He's the heart of it, isn't he? These kids, they're learning more than mechanics. They're learning what it means to care about something." John's jaw tightened, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. "That's Henry. Always has been." The crowd began to thin as the drizzle turned to a steady rain, but the energy in the shop never faded. Henry, despite his fatigue, refused to sit, moving from one student to another, his voice a constant presence. John watched him closely, noting the way his hands shook slightly, the way he paused to steady his breathing. He was pushing himself, but this was where he belonged, not in a hospital bed, but here, passing on what he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. A group of older customers gathered near the restored Chevy, their conversation turning to the shop's early days. Henry was barely 30 when he opened this place, one said, his voice warm with memory. "Took a chance on a nobody like me, fixed my car so I could get to work. Changed my life." Another nodded, his eyes misty. "He's been more than a mechanic to this town. He's family." John listened, the weight of their words settling in. This was why he'd fought for this, not just for Henry, but for everyone whose lives he'd touched. As evening approached, the rain slowed and the shop grew quieter. Henry stood at the workbench, wiping down a set of pliers with a rag, his movements slow but deliberate. John approached, his hands in his pockets, the hum of the day still lingering in the air. "You holding up?" he asked. Henry snorted, not looking up. "Better than I was in that damn hospital bed." He set the pliers down, his gaze drifting to the sign outside, its letters glowing under the streetlights. "Guess I owe you one kid." John shook his head, his voice low but firm. "You don't owe me anything, Henry. You already gave back more than you know." Henry's brow creased, skeptical. "How's that?" John gestured to the shop, to the students packing up their tools, to the walls that held decades of history and the promise of decades more. "By showing these kids what it means to do something right, to take pride in your work, to build something that lasts. That's your legacy, Henry. Not just this shop, but what you're teaching them how to care, how to keep going, how to make a difference." Henry's eyes softened, and for a moment he looked almost unguarded. He turned away, clearing his throat. "You talk too much," he muttered, but there was a warmth in his voice, a crack in his usual gruffness. John laughed, clapping him gently on the shoulder. "Get used to it. I'm sticking around." As Henry locked up, he paused outside the rain, now a faint mist. The sign above the shop stood out against the darkening sky, its words, a quiet vow, because some things deserve to be done right. Henry thought of the kids he'd taught today, their clumsy hands and hungry eyes, their potential unfolding under his guidance. He thought of the years he'd poured into this shop, the cars he'd fixed, the people he'd helped. And he thought of John, a stranger, who'd seen something in him worth saving. For the first time in a long time, Henry felt a sense of peace, a certainty that his work would live on, carried forward by hands he'd helped shape. He glanced at John, who stood nearby watching the last cars pull away. "Didn't think I'd see a day like this," Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper. John smiled his eyes on the glowing sign. "You earned it." The Henry Carter Technical Garage stood as a beacon not just of mechanics, but of something deeper, the power of doing things right, of building, with care, of leaving a mark that endures. For those who hear this story, the lesson is clear. Legacy isn't about wealth or fame, but about the lives you touch, the values you pass on, the work you do with purpose. Henry Carter had spent his life fixing what was broken, and in doing so he'd fixed something bigger. A community, a future, a belief that hard work and heart could still change the world. Every student who walked out of that shop, every car they repaired, every challenge they faced with the lessons Henry taught them carried a piece of his spirit. And that was the truest kind of legacy, one that lives, grows, and inspires long after the tools are set down.